Optionals. Optionals are a powerful feature in Swift that allows you to represent the absence of a value. This is useful for cases where a variable might not have a value, such as when data is missing or an operation fails. Now, in this particular section, we're going to look at what are optionals, unwrapping optionals, and optional chaining. Now, what are optionals? An optional is a type that can hold either a value or nil, which represents the absence of a value. You declare an optional by appending a question mark to the type. Let's go through each one of them in some examples. For example, let's say I create an optional string of the type string. The way I set it up as optional is by putting a question mark here. Now it might or might not have a value. In this case, I'll explicitly give it a value, saying that it's an optional string. It can have a value, it might not have a value. In this case, it does. I can create another variable, say optional int. It's similar, you just int with question mark and give it some value. It can have a value, might not, so you can just leave it however you like it. Same thing for optional bool. You say it's of the type bool, question mark, and leave it as it is. Next we have is optional double question mark and give it a value or set it to nil. So that works perfectly. Here I can just give it true for now. But this is what optionals look like. This is how you declare optionals. In this particular example, optional string, optional int, and optional bool are optionals that can hold either a value or nil. Now let's look at unwrapping optionals. So how do you look at the values inside the optional? Since optionals can be nil, you need to safely unwrap them to access their values. There are several ways to unwrap optionals in Swift. One of the way is called as forced unwrapping. Now, forced unwrapping is something that we saw earlier in one of the example where you use the exclamation mark. Forced unwrapping uses the exclamation operator to unwrap an optional and access its value. This should only be used when you are sure that the optional contains a value, or it will cause a runtime error if the optional is nil. So in this case, for example, optional double is nil and you used force unwrapping, it will give you a runtime error. Let's look at an example. So possible number, I'll say it might be an int or a nil. I'll give it a value 1, 2, 3. And now I can force unwrap it by saying if possible number not equal to nil, then I can say print. What do I want to print? The number is possible number exclamation mark. Now if I leave it like this, it says string interpolator produces a debug description for an optional value. Did you mean to make the explicit? So if you look at this, what happened here is if I don't use that exclamation mark for an optional, it will say number is optional 1, 2, 3. So I have to use this. When I use this, it's unwrapped from its optional shell and say number is 1, 2, 3. So this is how you can use it. Another option is using optional binding. Now optional binding uses something called as if let or guard let to safely unwrap an optional. This is the preferred way to handle optionals because in this case, if it's nil, it might cause runtime error. So let's look at optional binding examples. Go next line and I'll say let optional name string question mark equal to Alice. Next we say if let, this is how you do optional binding, name equal to optional name print hello name. I'll give exclamation mark. This is part of the string though, so I'll just remove it just to not confuse. Else I'll say print no name provided. So what happens in this case is it will check. If you see optional name is of the type optional, it has Alice inside it. So what it does is if let it will take the optional name and assign it to name. It will unwrap that and assign it to name. And if the name exists, it will say print hello with the name, or else it will say no name provided. Let me run this. It will print both the above one and below. So it says hello Alice. But if I run it without a name, it will say okay, let's set it, give it a value of nil. Run it. If you say no name provided, because the value of that is nil. Similarly, we can, let me just get rid of this previous one, everything before that, and here let me create a function greet with name and string, which comes as optional. We're passing an optional here to this. The way it will work is I will call this function greet and name I'll pass as Bob. Now I'm passing a name here. I can also pass nil here. So in this case, if it was not an optional, it would just give an issue, because if it's a nil and you're not unwrapping it, it would cause a problem. So to unwrap it, we'll use guard let this time. I'm saying name equal to name that is passed to me, else print. So in this case, it's the opposite of if let, where it's saying let's check if the name exists. If the name doesn't exist, what I want to do is I'm going to say no name provided, and then I'll just return it. And another option is, and after that, if there is a, let's say, so what happens is in this case it will check if name is not available, it will just say no name provided and return. But if it has a name, it will just go to the next line. Well, I can say hello slash name. Now if I run it, the first case where it's calling Bob, it's saying hello Bob. The second time it's where it's passing nil, it's saying no name provided. The first one is coming from the previous example, but yeah, this from the if let, and this one, the second two are coming from the guard let. So this is how we can unwrap using if let or guard let. The difference between two is if there is a value inside value, the if let becomes quite long, whereas guard let is much more easier. If you find an optional value somewhere, you can just skip through it and don't have to dig deep into complex data structures. Next option is nil coalescing operator, which is the double question mark. The nil coalescing operator provides a default value if the optional is nil. So the way it works is, let's go here, and in this case I'm going to say let optional value of the type int is equal to nil. We get rid of these previous stuff, nil, and now I'm saying let default value equal to 10. Now I say let result equal to optional value. Now the optional value is nil, so if I assign that to result, it might cause problem. So I'm going to say if there is no value in there, I want to use the default value for result. Now in this case I can say print, just going to pass print result, run it, I'll see 10. Now if this value was, let's say 23, run it, it will give me 23 because it got that value. So this is another way of unwrapping optionals. Now let's look at optional chaining. Optional chaining allows you to call properties, methods, and subscripts on optional that might currently be nil. If the optional is nil, the call returns nil, otherwise it returns the expected value. Let's look at it using a class definition. I know we did not do classes yet, but if you have basic ideas of classes, it's exactly same in Swift. I'm going to create a class person with object with one of the property as the residence of the type residence, which is a question mark, because that is another class residence, and that has a property of number of rooms. I'm going to say a particular property or residence has number of rooms. By default it's 1. Now let's create a person. Let's create a person John with the person class. So this creates a person object with the residence which has 1 room in there. Now if let room count room count equal to John dot residence. Now I'm saying residence, it might not have a value, so I'm going to say residence, does it have a value? So that's optional chaining for you, because I'm trying to look at number of rooms inside this. If this is nil, it will just stop there and not do anything else. If room count John dot residence dot number of rooms, print John's residence has, what was that, room count rooms, you don't know, it might be 1 or multiple, so I'm going to put it like this. Else I'll say print unable to retrieve the number of rooms, and at the end, next I can do is John dot residence equal to residence. I'm creating a function here where I'm saying this residence, which was never created, what will happen in the first time if I run it? Unable to retrieve number of rooms, because what happens is I'm creating a person object here which has a residence object, but that residence object was never created. So now the residence object is created in here. Now I can use the same if let room count equal to the same John dot residence dot number of rooms, and it will give me the number of rooms to be 1. I run it. First time when it run it, it gives me this. Next, once the residence is created, it will say the value is 1. So that's how it works. So this is optional chaining, where using this question mark at the end of an optional value, you can see if you can use that parameter or not. Now let's do a practical example on this. So open a new playground if you want to, and you can code around alongside with me. In this particular case, what we're going to do is we're going to create a string and an int which were optional, and we're going to do forced unwrapping, and then we'll do optional binding with iflet and optional binding with guardlet, and also nil coalescing operator, we'll use that, and then we'll look at optional chaining along with it. So let's start. First, as I mentioned, let's create an optional string. And I'll give it some value Swift. When I said we'll create an optional int, and for this I'll give this year's year 2024. Next, do forced unwrapping. Now if optional string is not equal to nil, print optional string has a value optional, not string. So this is our forced unwrapping. Next we'll do optional binding with iflet. Oh, I forgot something, and that's the forced unwrapping character. Next, let's look at optional binding. So if let unwrapped string equal to optional string. So if it has a value, I'll say print optional string has a value. In this case is the unwrapped string, because we are assigning unwrapping it using if let here. Else we'll say print optional string is nil. Make sense? Oh, forgot to put side the string. Okay, next what we'll do is we'll look at optional binding with guardlet. So let's create a function, and I'm going to say print here optional here int question mark, passing an optional here, say guard let here equal to optional here that is passed. Else what should we do? We say print here is nil, and once we're done with this we say return for this function. If it works through, if there's a value, we say print here is here, that got unwrapped here. So this is the use of a guardlet. If you want to call this, what we'll do is print here and pass it the optional int that we created above, print here, and I'll pass it nil just for you to play around with it. Let me know if it works. If not, leave a comment and I'll get back to you. Next, let's look at the nil coalescing character operator. Say default here equal to optional int, or let's say 2000. Print default here is default here. So I've created default here where I'm taking the optional int's value. If the value exists, it will assign it to this, or else it will assign 2000. And finally, let's look at optional chaining. How did we do it? We'll create this time a class car where it has a model which is string optional, and I can say let my car equal to car, my car dot model equal to Tesla, and I'll say if let car model equal to my car dot model, I can say print car model is car model. Else we'll say print car model is nil. So let's run this just to see if everything works. Optional string has a value Swift, which was from the first one here. Next one 2 using, this was forced unwrapping. Then next what we did after forced unwrapping is optional binding with if let, and we got the value here. Next we did the guardlet where we are seeing the year where the value is exists, so it's going to say this. But the second time when I'm passing specifically nil, it's saying here is nil. Then we are doing the default option here. We're using the coalescing operator, the nil coalescing operator, double question mark, where since the year is there, it's going to say 2024. If it was not there, it would give, if it was nil, it would use 2000. Next we are creating this car model, and it's saying car model is Tesla because we create the car object and then assign it some value. If I don't, then it will just run through that and it will give me car model. So I hope you understood how optionals work and what are different things. So you learned about optionals which allow variables to hold nil values. You explored different ways to safely unwrap optionals, including the forced unwrapping, optional binding, and then the nil coalescing operator. You practiced using optional chaining to access properties and methods on optional values. So if you have any problems here, just let me know in the comments and I'll get back to you. Next steps for us is like optionals are an essential part of Swift, helping you write safer and more robust code. The next section will cover closures, which are self-contained blocks of functionality that can be passed around and used in your code. They are something like functions but can be run one time and they have their own shell. We'll look at it. Stay tuned.